Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're ready to dive back into the ongoing series from Extra History concerning the scandals during Ulysses S. Grant's 2 terms as President of the United States. It looks like this one is going to cover the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is probably the most famous of the scandals that happened during his term in office. The title of this video is The Railroad Scandal. I'll put the link down in the description below. I'll also put the link back to episode 1 of this reaction series so you can check it out. You can also check it out without my commentary over on Extra History. Definitely subscribe to them. That way when the next part of the series comes out, you'll be able to watch it. I want to thank Roberto in Arganil, Portugal. You might be my first Portuguese patron that I can recall, at least on the list of ones that I've done a shout out to. So thank you, Roberto, so much for your support on Patreon. Let's dive into this one.
September 4th, 1872. About 2 months before the presidential election, the New York Sun dropped a blockbuster report. The Union Pacific Railroad has been bribing members of Congress. Congressman Oakes Ames, a major promoter of the Union Pacific Railroad and head of Credit Mobilier, one of the construction companies working on the Transcontinental Railroad, has been paying members of Congress in both cash and discounted Credit Mobilier stock.
So if you have seen the TV show Hell on Wheels, which is fantastic, by the way, I highly recommend it. They covered the Credit Mobilier scandal as part of all of that. And we mentioned this in the previous episode. Anytime you have a whole bunch of land that's available, or you have the government involved in something that opens up new territory, the potential for fraud is just massive. And you have all of this land that has opened up in the West, and you have these railroads that are competing to, complete these railroad access to these different places, and you've got towns springing up along the Transcontinental Railroad as it's being built from both the West and the East. There's so many opportunities here for people to see a get-rich-quick scheme.
All of this laid out in letters leaked to the paper. More than that, though, Credit Mobilier is in fact a shell company, with its board the same as owners Union Pacific, formed so it could create inflated construction invoices to bilk the U.S. government. And this revelation roils the 1872 election, because while Ulysses S. Grant is not involved in this scandal, both his previous Vice President Schuyler Colfax and his new running mate Henry Wilson are...
So Schuyler Colfax was previously the Speaker of the House. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, you see him presiding over the events that take place there. Schuyler Colfax, he runs with Grant in '68. He's on the ticket to give some real credibility as far as having an actual politician who has actual government experience on the ticket with Grant.
Very much tied to the tracks of this story, watching the Credit Mobilier train barrel straight towards them.
And a lot of congressmen are involved. Future President Garfield, who is a pretty above-board guy, is even implicated in all of these scandals. And I don't think he was involved, but he didn't really come out forcefully enough in going after the people who were.
Thanks so much to Helix Sleep for sponsoring this episode. To learn about their 4th of July sale and get 20% off site-wide, check out the link below. Rewinding a bit. On May 10th, 1869, the head of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads drove the Golden Spike into the ground at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory.
This is 2 months after Grant became president for the first time. At the time, presidents were sworn in March. It didn't switch to January until... I think Franklin Roosevelt was president in the 30s.
Which symbolized the joining of their lines and inaugurated the first transcontinental railroad. Ulysses S. Grant was not present for this event, but the proceedings were sent to him in real time via telegraph. Though the Transcontinental Railroad wasn't actually finished yet, it hadn't fully reached Chicago, it spoke of a task almost complete. A major victory in an infrastructure project that had been stalled by the Civil War. And the railroad was one of the greatest things linking Grant's time as a military general and his time as president.
Yeah, let's stop and just consider this for a minute, because even after California and those Western territories become part of the United States, when we're talking back into the 1830s and 1840s. I've been playing over in the gaming channel, playing the Oregon Trail, right? So the people that are going west are going over land in wagons, right? And it takes months to get across. The alternative is to take a boat and go all the way down around South America to come up the other side, and that takes months. So to have a railroad that connects the eastern United States to the western United States and goes across a lot of that territory where you still have a lot of Native Americans, and it can be very dangerous, not only because of the threat of violence, but also the threat of disease and just all the things that can go wrong. This is a game changer to have connection like this.
As a war commander, he used the Union's superior railroad networks to help move troops and supply his armies, making use of the fact that the northern systems were longer, had more lines, and fewer variations in gauge.
Yeah.
It played a major role in the Union's victory. Then also, Grant's presidency oversaw a boom in railway construction, much of which, ironically, would benefit the South, as Northern and Californian-based concerns bought up, refurbished, and expanded the South's frequently broken down and bankrupt lines. Rail connectivity served a political role as well, tying the country together so that the economic split between Northern mercantile capitalism and the Southern agrarian slave state would no longer be a divider, as it was pre-war. Not to mention, it facilitated expansion west. But the world of railroad expansion was crazy dirty. Like the way we all
Big
talk
time.
about banking and big tech today, yeah, that's how people talked about the railroads in the 19th century.
So I like that he makes that connection, because it's always been a part of the human experience, is that people look for opportunities to get rich quick, and that leads to corruption, especially when influence is involved. Go all the way back. Even if you read the Bible, if you read in the New Testament, you see how tax collectors are described. Well, why were tax collectors described that way? Well, because they were taking advantage of the system to get rich. Rome would come to a tax collector and say, okay, you need to collect 5 shillings from, what am I saying, shillings? 5 dinars from person X. And then the tax collector goes to them and says, you owe 7 dinars in tax. Well, what are they doing with the other 2? They're pocketing that, and then they're giving the 5 to Rome. And it was understood by everybody this was going on. People have always taken advantage of the system.
In fact, for more about railroad fraud, you can take a look at our Teddy the Trustbuster series right here, because boy oh boy was that time period also a doozy for choo-choo corruption. Actually, on that note, America in general was also just very corrupt in the 19th century, which we alluded to a little bit in the last episode. Remember, part of the rift between Grant and his Republican Congress was that he didn't let powerful senators, like Sumner, engage in the spoils system, passing out appointments to supporters and friends. But it really did go beyond that. Corruption was rampant nationwide, at local, state, and federal levels. Awarding government jobs and contracts to friends and family or political supporters was fairly common. Sure,
Yep.
There were norms and traditions that frowned on nepotism, but it largely wasn't actually illegal. In fact, political machines like Tammany Hall, and less famous versions nationwide, weaponized this doling out of appointments to keep folks semi-permanently in power.
Right. And, this is every system, political party system that we've gone through in the United States has had its signature issues. And part of the reason why we have political party systems, times in history when the parties shift and the demographics shift and the electorate shifts, is based on what those dominating issues are. And so for early part of the United States, you've got things like slavery is a major issue, and tariffs, and of course westward expansion, the whole idea of manifest destiny. Now you're getting into the post-Civil War, and you're dealing with things like the monetary system, gold standard, silver standard, paper money, taxation. Tariffs are still a big issue, and the spoils system and corruption in government is a big issue.
Heck, people outright sold seats in state legislatures. But even by 19th century standards, this Credit Mobilier scandal was shocking. First of all, Union Pacific created a shell construction company, which it claimed to be a separate entity, and used it to inflate construction costs in order to pocket government money meant for the Transcontinental Railroad. aka robbing the American people.
Yep.
Second, the outwardly respectable Massachusetts congressman, Oaks Ames, had then sold Credit Mobilier stock at a discount to other congressmen in exchange for favoring the Union Pacific in votes and not opening investigations.
So it's kind of a rotational thing, right? So you create the shell company inflates the cost of everything so that it can extort money from the government, and then you use that same company to then influence Congress to make sure that government stays favorable to the company that it's inflating. It's crazy.
These congressmen could then turn around and sell the discounted stock at market value, pocketing the profits, or collect the dividend, which was larger than the discounted sale price. Ames also distributed cash, because at this point, why not? Of the 15 congressmen initially named in the scandal, 14 were Republicans, 2 of whom were Schuyler Colfax, Grant's previous vice president, and Henry Wilson, his second-term running mate. Wilson, however, denied accepting anything from Ames. Now, the New York Sun, the paper that blew the scandal open, was a frequent critic of the Grant administration. And it was pretty clear the Sun hoped that this story would damage his campaign. But
So we should take that with a grain of salt, that the people implicated just so happened to be Grant's former running mate and current running mate. That all said, that doesn't mean they weren't involved. It just means that when key figures are implicated in something like this, we have to be much more diligent in making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed on who gets blamed.
That didn't happen, and it was really for 2 major reasons. First, it was clear that Grant himself was not involved. Indeed, he wasn't even in government when the bribes were paid in 1867. And second, his opponent in the election, the newspaper editor Horace Greeley, backed by an alliance between Democrats and Republicans dissatisfied with Reconstruction, was a weak candidate. Actually, literally weak, it turned out, since Greeley died 24 days after Election Day, before the electoral votes could be awarded. But even alive, Grant had absolutely buried him in the Electoral College and got over 55% of the popular vote. Though the blast wave of the Credit Mobilier scandal swept across the Republican Party after Grant's re-election and into the beginning of his new term, it didn't tarnish Grant personally. But since it touched a number of people within his inner circle, it further drove the narrative that even if Grant was honest, his government was still deeply.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and it also begs the question then, like, if we take the old adage, the buck stops here, what are you doing? Why are you permitting this stuff? And it goes back to Grant's mix of naivete and just generally not understanding that just because he personally was above board and tended to be a man of honor, not everyone else was, and he kind of expected that they would be.
Corrupt. This was especially true after an investigation found that Henry Wilson did in fact accept Credit Mobilier stock from Ames, with a dividend, mind you, that was far higher than the low purchase price. However, Wilson testified that he never personally handled it. His late wife did. And when he realized the transaction was skeezy, he returned the stock and all dividends before the scandal became public. He was cleared, along with most of the accused. But that fact was a bit of a scandal in itself. Because, real talk for a moment, the U.S. has never really been that great at holding government figures accountable. Gestures broadly to the present and all of the past. Because let's remember, even guys like...
Listen, I know some are going to get upset that they brought the present into it, but he also said, and all of the past. This, as I said earlier, this has been an always problem, and it's not just an American problem. It is a world problem. It's a humanity problem, because humans by nature are selfish, and we don't care often who gets hurt, especially when it's a faceless victim, the government of the United States, that we are fleecing.
Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis ultimately weren't prosecuted after the Civil War.
Right.
Oaks Ames himself, the one handing out bribes from Credit Mobilier, simply got away with a formal censure, though he did die of a stroke 3 months later. So, no one was exactly punished. They didn't get fined or go to jail. And this declaration that actually, everything is fine, yeah, we would argue that that is part of the overall corruption. Meaning even though Credit Mobilier was really a Johnson administration scandal rather than a Grant administration scandal, it still did add to the cloud of wrongdoing surrounding Grant and his inner circle.
That's true.
Not for nothing, the Republican Congress wasn't exactly helping with that vibe on their end either, especially since the day before Grant's inauguration, they passed an act to raise the salary of the president, Supreme Court justices, and in a late addition, Congress. Now, to be fair,
we actually now have a constitutional amendment that prevents this. Congress can pass itself a pay raise since it's responsible for that legislation, but it can't apply to the current Congress. An election has to take place before it takes effect, so that people have a chance to vote out the people who passed their own pay raise.
It was generally known that the president needed to be paid more, given he was socially expected to pay for expensive parties and receptions out of his own pocket. The $25,000 salary meant that it actually cost money to be president, so boosting it to $50K was uncontroversial. But the public revolted over Congress giving themselves a raise, which newspaper editors dubbed the Salary Grab Act. The public mood whipsawed against Congress so fast that they ended up withdrawing the congressional increase, which was probably wise, since the Panic of 1873 later that year drew into sharp focus the issues of economic equality as the country entered recession.
Yeah, that's a great point. Think about the optics of Congress passing itself a pay raise while the country is going through what amounts to a depression.
Just a little piece of history that folks that'll never watch this video but really should might want to keep in mind. But that's none of my business. Another thing not helping with this perception was Grant's feud with Senator Charles Sumner, which had dragged out since his first term. Recapping that a bit, the two fell out over Grant's plan to annex Santo Domingo, starting with the fact that Grant had sent his aide Orville Babcock to negotiate with the president of Santo Domingo without the involvement from Congress or the State Department.
So if you want to know more about all of that, I highly recommend Ron Chernow's book, Grant, which is fantastic. I mean, everything Chernow does is great. His Hamilton book is great, too. I've heard his Washington book is as well. I haven't read that one. But he goes into detail about all of this stuff regarding Santo Domingo and the agreement to purchase it and Congress not doing it and Charles Sumner being at the heart of it.
However, this clash over separation of powers, which, hey, that's totally legitimate, did overlay a personal conflict over Grant not giving a government appointment to Sumner's friend. The rhetoric got so nasty that Sumner got thrown out of the Foreign Relations Committee and began attacking Grant in public, calling him a wannabe monarch, heading a congressional investigation over the treaty, and alleging all kinds of impropriety. Some of those accusations turned out to be true. For example, Sumner discovered that while on his mission, Babcock had been gifted property in Santo Domingo which would explode in value after any annexation. When Congress killed the Santo Domingo Treaty, Grant took it real personal, because now he had accusations coming at him from both his own party as well as those unhappy with Reconstruction.
And I'm guessing again that Grant was doing this out of a good faith place, trying to negotiate for Santo Domingo. He saw real benefits to the United States in having it. But again, people under him were taking advantage of the potential for expansion and new territory to make a few bucks.
Conveniently enough, those voices tended to merge at times. While Sumner accused Grant of behaving like Caesar, those representing white former Confederates in the South were only too happy to pick up the accusation, as Grant sent federal troops and the newly formed Justice Department to suppress Klan activity and protect black voters. Southern Democrats framed this as dictatorial tyranny. On issues like civil rights, Grant occupied a moral high ground that even the former Confederates trying to resist these policies found pretty unassailable. However, by highlighting corruption and overreach in Grant's Republican Party, both real and imagined, Southern politicians and newspaper editors managed to chip away at Grant's moral authority.
That's a great point. Unfortunately, and we talk about this all the time in videos, is that the good you do often gets overshadowed by the negatives. And so people, because they look at you through the negative stuff, it to them tarnishes everything. Look at what we're doing right now with folks like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. I mean, we're seeing a lot of places that are removing the name of someone like Thomas Jefferson from schools and from memorials. Why? Because he was a slave owner. Well, we've always known he was a slave owner. This is not news, but people are finding it increasingly difficult to look at Thomas Jefferson and see the Declaration of Independence and see the other things that he did without seeing it through the lens of his owning of people. And the same thing was happening in Grant's time.
And Grant's second term? Yeah, that gave them a lot to go on. Because during that time, the scandals went right off the rails and directly into mailboxes and tax returns. Now, in fairness to start, Grant was well aware of the abuses in the public service and actually wanted to stop them. On March 3rd, 1871, he signed a law creating the first Civil Service Commission, a congressional commission aimed at setting up a system where government employees would be evaluated and hired based on qualifications rather than loyalty to whatever party was coming into power.
And this is a buildup toward the eventual real civil service reform that's going to happen a decade later with things like the Pendleton Act signed by Chester Arthur.
However, when the 2-year funding on the commission ran out, the Senate refused to fund it again. Because the spoils system? Well, that was working just fine for them.
Yep.
Meanwhile, it was clear that reform was badly needed, as the embarrassments kept coming. The first true scandal of Grant's second term involved the star routes. Basically postal routes that served places out west where the official U.S. Postal Service had not yet reached. These were handled by contractors who frequently pressed the government to pay them high fees for the service and resisted oversight. In 1872, Congress opened an investigation into bid rigging by these contractors, alleging that they colluded to drive up fees for contracts, then split the results.
Yeah, so how does it work? Well, you've got two companies competing for a contract. They talk to each other and say, okay, let's both put in higher bids instead of trying to undercut each other and trying to do the lowest bidder. Let's both put in high bids. Whichever one gets picked, we'll split the profit. So either way, we're both making out. I mean, it's so shady, but exactly what you would expect.
Investigation ended prematurely, likely due to bribes from the companies, and though Grant temporarily shut off the route contracts after another accusation in 1876, this rigging would continue into the 1880s. However, this paled in comparison to the Sanborn incident, which consumed political discussion for the first 5 months of 1874. All right, let's set the scandal board again. In 1872, Congress passed a bill allowing the Bureau of Internal Revenue to hire several people to identify persons or organizations who were delinquent on their taxes. Congressman Benjamin Butler,
not the IRS, they would never do such a thing,
recommended his friend John Sanborn for the role, and Treasury Secretary William Adams Richardson hired him as a private citizen. Under this agreement with Richardson, Sanborn acted as a kind of financial bounty hunter who took a 50% commission on any delinquent taxes he extracted.
So you can't imagine for a second that somebody who's getting a 50% commission on delinquent taxes that he collects. Think of all the ways that that possibly could be abused. Number one, you could get paid off by somebody for a fraction of the cost. They could just pay you half of it, or maybe a little more than half of what they owe, for you to ignore it and make it go away, right? So if you owe $1 million and you pay $600,000 to Sanborn directly, that's more than he would have made in commission on collecting the whole $1 million, but you get off barely paying more than half. Or he could look for places where money is owed that it really isn't owed in order to make money.
And it was not a hard job, mind you. He just went to the offices of Internal Revenue in Boston and picked up a list of 39 whiskey distillers the government believed to be delinquent. Then he walked into their corporate offices and said, "Mitch better have my money." That's how the song goes, right? If the guy's name was Mitch, was his name Mitch? It wasn't. Well, you get the idea. Sanborn acted less like a tax collector and more like he was running an extortion racket. Because he basically was.
Yep.
Sanborn would intimidate companies with the force of the federal government behind him, threatening them into paying taxes they probably would have ended up paying anyway. Then he'd take a 50% cut. And, to maximize his payout, he'd at times falsely accuse companies of trying to evade taxes,
There you go.
extorting even larger amounts than what was actually owed. In fact, he was so successful that the Treasury expanded his list of delinquent taxpayers again and again. First, by adding 750 names, then 2,000 more, then extending his collecting into 592 railroad companies, then 150 more,
Gosh.
then all the railroad companies in the U.S. Sanborn even turned the government department to his advantage. As a contractor, he was supposed to work for Internal Revenue, but as his portfolio expanded, government employees, they were made to start working for him.
And the more the government increases in size, the more opportunities there are for corruption within the government, because it gets so massive. There are so many employees. There are so many loopholes. There are so many ways people can take advantage of it without necessarily being caught or having the proper oversight. It's just ridiculous.
By the time this all came out, and Sanborn and 2 other contractors were indicted in January 1874, he'd collected a total of $526,000 in taxes, giving himself a commission of $213,000. Though he had to pay $156K of that to the vast number of assistants he'd hired to squeeze taxpayers. Despite the outrage surrounding this, Sanborn was, you guessed it, acquitted. Everything he'd done had been covered by the agreements he'd signed with Treasury Secretary Richardson. He went back home to Minnesota and served 2 terms as a state senator. Meanwhile, Secretary Richardson resigned. In thanks, Grant appointed him as a judge to save him from full disgrace. That was a close one, folks. I thought we'd actually see someone face consequences this time, but we dodged a bullet there. But little did Grant know that even as the Sanborn incident was exploding, the defining scandal of his presidential career was already bubbling beneath the surface, and it would once again deal with taxes on distillers. I'm of course talking about the whiskey ring, and Orville Babcock would once again be at the center of it. When he wasn't trying to break into a safe.
Some people just can't help themselves.
That, of course, is a different scandal after the whiskey ring, and we'll tell you all about that next time.
All right, as always, great work from our friends at Extra History. I want to thank Matt Roof and Adam Davies for your support on Patreon. Some big announcements coming up in the weeks ahead. Some things that our patrons are already aware of, because I've posted some things for our patrons and members about group trips for next year. Check those out. See you again soon. Thanks for watching.